Salam Media. Now, May the 3rd was the World Press Freedom Day. And as I am sitting in the studio, I am looking at a picture, and the picture has got the word media. But each alphabet is made up of a little block with a name. And this was a picture that was taken in 2019. And this word media is made up of the names of murdered journalists. And I just did a quick count. And this is made up of 70 names, 70 journalists, July the 10th, 2019. And that was the statistic of the number of journalists that have been murdered. And I'm sure since 2019, there have been a lot more. We know the much talked about the global outcry came with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And this whole question about media repression and also gaining momentum in Africa, we see a number of countries with regards to media repression. We find Ethiopian journalists facing the death penalty for being critical of the government. Mali is being blamed for expelling journalists. We see it in Zimbabwe, Angola, Somalia as well. Journalists are in the firing line. And to talk about this, we're joined by journalists at Daily Maverick. This morning, we're talking with Carien Du Plessis. Carien, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm not, I freelance for Daily Maverick as well, but just to correct you.
Well, we'll just take freelance out of it, or we'll just add freelance onto it. But Karine, let's just unpack press freedom and the statistics that I quoted, horrific, and the situation is not getting easier for journalists, and particularly in Africa, we see this wave of media repression taking place.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure if it's getting worse or if it's always just been bad or if we're becoming more aware of it. So yeah, so I'm not saying I don't know if it's getting worse, but I must say, in South Africa, we're particularly lucky that we have a fair amount of media freedom. We can say what we like. We have a big diversity of media. So in that sense, yes, it's it's bad, but in South Africa, at least it got better than it was 30 years ago. But you mentioned Ethiopia, and I mean I think about Ethiopia a lot when I look at pictures of Ukraine, because in the Ukraine, I mean the war in Ethiopia has was one of the worst wars of 2021. It's been going on for more than a year, and we haven't. I mean, we've seen a few images from there, but nobody's paid half, well, not even a fraction of the attention that they did, to the Ukraine and the Ethiopian. The war there is was threatening to disrupt the Horn of Africa. It could be very it's pulling in a lot of other actors, and it's very disruptive. And then I thought about why, why it was like that. And I myself have sort of looked at going there and, reporting, not even from the front lines, just from the people living around the area, or people who's had family members going there to battle, or even people suffering from the economy, even as far as Addis Ababa. And there's been a big clampdown on media reporting at all from the country. And that's one of the reasons why the story hasn't come out in the same way that the Ukraine story. I mean, Ukraine has been wanting people to tell their story because they want sympathy. They want people to, to help them in their efforts. So yeah, so media freedom on the continent, it is something that it constantly bothers me. And I mean, I'm not saying that there's media freedom in Ukraine and Russia either. There's also an information war being fought there, but yeah, it's like you say, it's not something to celebrate at the moment.
Well, certainly, Karin, and in fact, it's quite interesting that you use Ukraine as an example because just over a month ago, I had a chat with an academic from the University of Johannesburg who specifically mentioned Ethiopia and the catastrophe that has been unfolding there for a very, very long time. And looking at the mainstream media obviously focusing on Ukraine, but just coming to Africa and looking at legislation. And one concern that we see, and we don't see it in South Africa, but we see this wave of repressive laws that governments have introduced, and this obviously is a threat to journalism in Africa in general.
Yes, no, that's indeed. I mean, I'm not. I've been so busy, I haven't had time to reflect on Media Freedom Day. The other day, things have been a little bit busy for us as freelancers. um, but but yeah, I mean, I can't claim to be up to date with the laws introduced, but it's certainly. I mean, the legislation is one thing. The other thing would be um, the repression that's not legislated, the censorship. I mean, to come back to Ukraine, I mean, well, I think Ethiopia has been complete censorship, complete blackout of information coming out of the country, and it's been very difficult to get into Tigray, which is where the war is being waged. But even looking at Ukraine and Russia, I'm constantly skeptical when I hear reports from there. And I sort of, turn it over a few times before I believe anything, because I believe I remember in the beginning of the war, there was the story about Snake Island. I don't know if you remember that story.
Mm,
It's become quite a legend apparently in Ukraine. There were some Ukrainians on this island called Snake Island, and the Russians came and said to them, surrender the island. And they said some words that I can't repeat on radio. And then the story went that they were shot. And very reputable news agencies, news papers that I go to when I want to see if news is true, they carried this story. And a few days later, it emerged that they were not shot; they were taken prisoner of war. So yeah, so I think um, even if there's no laws that regulate media freedom, we should, always check disinformation that comes out. Um, I think that's also a threat to media freedom and to to freedom of information and to the correct information getting to the correct channels. So
yes.
yeah, so that's something I've been thinking about a lot as well.
Mm. But also at the same time, when we know about journalists being detained, we know about journalists that have been killed in the line of doing their duty, and of major concern is nobody is being brought to book for these attacks on journalists across the continent, and we know the huge uproar that had taken place, and it's still a major talking point with regard to Jamal Khashoggi, and we know the Turkish government has now wash their hands off. And Saudi Arabia, there are still huge question marks with regard to whether justice has truly been served as well. So again, yeah, is it's about holding people accountable and responsible for these attacks, and obviously the death and the killing of these journalists, Karin.
Yes, no, indeed. And I think journalists, I don't think journalists are unique in being persecuted politically. I mean, we've seen opposition politicians, activists, we've seen them being persecuted as well. But I think as journalists, we're in a unique position to campaign and to put pressure on governments and to get this information out. And I know that there are some organizations doing really good work with regards to that. So I think, I think it's important that we should uh, number one, keep this, keep our activism alive and keep telling the story of journalists and other activists too who get arrested and persecuted in the line of duty. But also, we need to make sure that those journalists are free to tell, that they're free to tell the story and they're not afraid to tell the story in those countries. And I think it's important that when we live in a fairly free country like South Africa, that we give support to them, that we do tell their stories, and that we do put pressure I mean, it's something that's very often neglected by, I know, even our own government, that we should put pressure on our government to also put pressure on those governments to keep the media free. But that sometimes feels like a bit of a lost cause, because I don't see a lot of that kind of work being done. But I do think we should keep that activism alive.
Yes, and it's not only the local journalists we're talking about, Karine. We're talking about foreign journalists, and we've heard about the Spanish journalists that were killed in Burkina Faso. We've heard about a French reporter who was kidnapped in Mali. So, foreign journalists in some of these countries in Africa are under threat as well.
Yes, no, and I think they're under threat. It's perhaps not as bad for them as it is for the local journalists. But I do think foreign journalists and foreign correspondents play a very important role. I mean, they sometimes sort of there's some what do you call it? People sometimes say, "Oh yeah, you just parachute in and tell the story and then leave." But sometimes that's also to the advantage of that journalist. I mean, I've even seen in some of our neighboring countries, like Eswatini, that I mean, that it's a very repressive country to live in for a journalist. But but if you go in there, you tell the story as true and as correctly as possible, and you leave. It's not quite the same as being, having to live there, having to raise your children there, um, and being hounded by the government. So I do think in that respect, it's important to look at foreign journalists as well, at their safety, and foreign correspondents, and look at their safety and look at the responsibility they have also to tell the story. And I think we as South African journalists should take that responsibility seriously as well. And I mean, we don't have to go to the Ukraine to tell an important story. We can just go across the border to Eswatini. We can go across the border to Lesotho, to Botswana, to Zimbabwe, to tell stories there that perhaps their journalists can't tell. And their journalists, I think, could do the same thing for us. So yeah, so I think press freedom, there's many dimensions to it, and there's a big responsibility on us as journalists.
Well, Karine, as always, we do appreciate you taking time out, talking to us, and thank you once again for coming on, talking to us this morning. All the best to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for asking me.
Carien Du Plessis, freelance journalist at Daily Maverick, and we're talking about media repression in Africa. And this came against the background of World Press Freedom Day, which was observed on the 3rd of May. The time is just gone 9:32 a.m. We come back, we'll be joined by Zenza Kushle Iman Kaba, with unpacking the Eid Lunch 2022 that occurred in Amarensha out in Johannesburg.